Welcome to this week's edition of Bob versus Willie. He's Bob Gerson. I'm Willie Witten. And this is the show, as I've said before, where I constantly have to educate Bob on whatever we're talking about during the week. But Bob's a good guy, so I put up with him. Bob, what are we talking about this week?
Well, we're going to talk about the top 10 blues rock guitarists of the 1980s.
All right. And we got some interesting picks. I think our lists are going to be a little bit different. I'll lead off with my number 10. My number 10, Bob, is Lonnie Brooks. I thought he was always fantastic.
Well, my number 10 is Lefty Diz. And Lefty Diz might not be a name that you're familiar with, but Lefty was left-handed guitar player, which is why he was lefty. And the reason he's Diz is because in the early days, he would copy Dizzy Gillespie's style of playing trumpet on his guitar in the alley as practice. My number 9 is Anson Thunderberg, another person that you may not be familiar with, but he was the lead guitarist and singer and writer for the Rockets, and the Rockets had a long career, and he influenced an awful lot of people.
My number 9 is Tinsley Ellis, guy who's still around these days, putting out some pretty good music. I think I do agree with you, Bob. The 80s decade was maybe his heyday, maybe was his high watermark, but plenty of good stuff from him in other decades as well. My number 8 is Robert Cray, and I'm pretty sure I think some people are going to think that the 8th spot is not high enough for him, but we'll get to that later. Bob, who do you got for 8 and 7?
Well, number 8 is Tinsley Ellis, so you already picked him, and my number 7 is Duke Robillard. Again, somebody you may not be familiar with, but Duke played in just about every band, including Bob Dylan, and won the W.C. Handy Award for Best Blues Rock Album in 69. No, I got the wrong year here. In 2000 and 2001. But the thing is, he was a really good guitar player, and he played probably on over 60 different albums by different musicians over the years, along with his own.
Yeah, which is amazing when you think about not just the longevity, but the amount of output. Pretty impressive. He didn't make my list, but I certainly have no qualms with that. My number 7 is Billy Gibbons. I was a little bit taken aback when I explained that to people. Some people don't know who that is, but they definitely know who that is. Mm-hmm. Billy Gibbons is ZZ Top. My number 6 pick is Albert Collins, consummate blues musician. Just the way he played influenced so many people. He has a unique voice in his playing. I don't know how much else there is to say. Truly wonderful musician.
Well, my number 6 is Lonnie Brooks, which you picked. And my number 5 is Frank Son Seals. Now, Frank Son Seals is another name that you might not know because he died in the early 90s. But the point is that before he died, he was hitting the big time when his wife shot him in the face. I'm sorry, he did not die in the early 90s. He died in 2004. Another dying mistake. Sorry about that. But the point is that he got shot in the face while he was sleeping by his wife. Survived, got plastic surgery, ended up going back on the road, and then got diagnosed with diabetes, had his leg amputated, and then after that kept playing until he got all his guitars stolen. But then he got a guitar and continued playing on the road, and unfortunately, he ended up dying because of, his mobile home also burned down at the same time. He was the true blues musician all the way to his death. And when he died in 2004, I mean, that was it.
Right. I mean, when you talk about singing the blues, sometimes you wonder about authenticity, and he certainly qualifies for authenticity. Bob, my number 5 happens to be also Son Seals. So everything you just said is the consummate blues musician, not just in his playing, but in the life he lived, in the hard deals he was dealt. My number 4 is the less famous brother of someone else who is on my list, and that is Jimmy Vaughn. He's an Austinite through and through. like his brother. Not necessarily as flashy as his brother, who we all know very well, but just a tremendous player and also a great band leader, I felt about him. Not as flashy, but a little more about the band. So he sits in my number 4 spot. Bob, who you got?
Well, I didn't pick him. Instead, I already picked somebody that I mentioned, Duke Robillard. It was a choice between the two of them. And the thing that's really interesting is they both played in the fabulous Thunderbirds.
Yep.
And the thing is, my number 4 was Billy Gibbons, who you already chose. And Billy obviously is one of the top guitar players. And my number 3, as you also picked, was Albert Collins. Now, Albert Collins is very important because he was part of the triumvirate of the 80s. The triumvirate of the 80s was made up of my top 3 people.
Yes, this is where I think the list will get interesting. My number 3 and my number 2 are probably going to cause some people to throw up their hands. My number 3, I picked Jeff Healey. Now, I know that the bulk of his work was the 90s, and I've seen a list that you've put out in the past, Bob, about 90s guitarists. He lives on your 90s list. According to the Bob Gersten rules, you only get to pick one decade. I put him here in the 80s because I just can think of Angel Eyes. I have an indelible memory of the first time I saw that music video. I felt that that album in the 88, 89 years were sort of his high watermark. I know that's not going to be thrilling to everyone. My number 2 is going to probably cause more consternation, and that's Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits. I've always been a big fan of his. I think some people might say he doesn't belong in blues rock. I think he does. Bob, who do you got in the rest of your list?
Well, for number 2, I have Robert Cray, who you listed up a little bit higher.
Yep.
And Robert Cray got discovered back when they were making Animal House, and he ended up in the band in the movie. And then after that, he got a record deal, and that catapulted him. He was also playing all around, and it was kind of confusing whether he was from Seattle or he was from Eugene or Portland. And I remember getting in arguments with people about it. And Stevie Ray Vaughan is my number 1. And I think that Stevie Ray Vaughan will pretty much be everybody's number 1. And when I said that he was the triumvirate, with the triumvirate, it's like the 3 people that popularized the blues, because the blues were kind of dying out. Right. And in the 80s, all of a sudden, the 3 people that made it alive, Albert Collins had been around. I mean, Albert Collins had been around since the 50s, but he didn't make it until the 60s. And then he really didn't make it big time until the 80s. And when he made it, it's like it was at the same time that Robert Cray came on the scene and Stevie Ray Vaughan did. And they all played together at one time. Well, I mean, Stevie Ray died right after the concert that he was playing with Robert Cray and Eric Clapton.
Right up in Alpine Valley. That's sort of local to my old haunts, being the city of Chicago in the Midwest. A very sad story. My number 1 also, Bob, is Stevie Ray Vaughan. Maybe it's boring for people who are tuning in, but it's hard for me to really pick anyone else besides him in that number 1 spot for the 80s. Our list towards the top got a little bit different, whether it's Collins and Cray, and I went with Knopfler and Jeff Healey. But I really can say I have no qualms with anyone that you picked. I think that like your selections and your reasons for them make a lot of sense. Before we let everyone go, are there any people on my list that you sort of disagree with me having in there?
Mark Knopfler is the one that I would disagree with the most. And the reason why is because even though I love Mark Knopfler and I think he's a fantastic guitar player, I don't consider him a blues guitar player. And, you know, it's like at the same time, if I were going to pick Mark Knopfler, there would be other people that I would pick. I mean, like I could pick Slash, or I could pick Joe Perry, or I could pick heck, Mike Campbell from Tom Petty. I mean, he's an amazing guitar player.
Right. And I sort of knew when I put Knopfler up there, I knew that this was sort of a rangy pick in that he does play some great blues. He does have some songs that are very bluesy, but I feel like a couple of weeks ago when we did a list of the 70s, I had David Gilmour. You sort of felt the same thing. I don't know. What can I say? We're out of time, Bob. Thanks for joining me. And for everyone out there, we'll see you next week. This has been Bob versus Willie. Catch you on the flip side.